The viewpoints expressed on Night Fright are not necessarily those of the host, the staff, the sponsors, or the affiliate stations. Tonight's program may contain graphic themes or images. Viewer discretion is advised.
There is a time for question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland. Welcome to Night Fright, everybody. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a beverage of your choice going. Have we got a great ride for you tonight? Get ready, settle in, because we're going to go to places all around the world, from exploring the Tower of London to investigating a haunted Colorado firehouse. Tonight, folks, paranormal researcher Richard Estep is going to take us all behind the scenes for an up-close and personal encounter with a fascinating legion of hauntings. Richard is going to share some of the most interesting and odd cases he's investigated over the past 20 years. Now, these cases took place both in England and the U.S. He used a variety of investigative methods, from high-tech gadgets to old-fashioned practices such as dowsing, table tipping, and Ouija boards. Yeah, we're going to be going there tonight, folks. Ouija boards. Richard is going to reveal what he has uncovered in the darkest of mysteries of the paranormal realm. Richard Estep has been involved in paranormal research since 1995. He's co-founded the Boulder County Paranormal Research Society, and of course, all his connections will be on the Night Fright website with his wife, Laura. His latest book is, and that's the one we're talking about tonight, In Search of the Paranormal. I want to welcome Richard to the show for the very first time, most definitely not the last. Thank you, Richard, for joining us. I take it you're in Boulder right now, are you?
It's a pleasure. I am in Boulder right now. I should say just outside Boulder, and you find me in the midst of packing my stuff to head to Atlanta tomorrow for DragonCon.
Oh, very cool, buddy. Very cool. Congratulations. That's going to be a lot of fun. That's going to be terrific. Okay, let's dive into your book right away. Now, something that's enticed me right off the top, the Tower of London. Who gets to investigate the Tower of London but Richard Estep? Richard, can you tell us?
Well, the answer actually is...
Go ahead.
Sure. The answer actually is nobody really gets to investigate the Tower of London. It's home to, amongst other things, the crown jewels. The Queen, the monarch, has her valuable stuff there. So you don't get to spend the night there or get locked in or anything like that. What you get to do is work around the place, make multiple visits, and get some history. When I say history, personal experiences from the people that work there. So it's one of those investigations where you're never able to completely control the environment. You're never able to get the place to yourself. It's just never going to happen. But just being in that environment after dark can be extremely intimidating and scary.
Now, were you allowed to approach the tourist guides, the perhaps security people, to get their stories? Because I'll tell you a story. I live in a place called Kingston, Canada. And this is the home of our founding father, Sir John A. Macdonald, who was a Scottish fellow. And when I approached the people at his home to do a show from there, talking about the paranormal and stuff, they were dead set against it, even though, quote unquote, Sir John A.'s ghost is supposed to be seen there all the time, because they didn't want that particular house or that part of Canadian history associated with the paranormal. Did you run into anything similar to that?
Not in the least. The folks that are tour guides there of the yeoman warders, what everybody called beefeaters. We've all seen them on gin bottles and in tourism, yeah. And in order to be one of those gentlemen or ladies, you have to be a senior non-commissioned officer in the British Armed Forces with exemplary conduct, and then you retire. It's a very competitive process to become one of those individuals. And so they're very level-headed, very good witnesses. They're also police officers legally. They're basically the Queen's protective force, or the monarch's protective force, whoever is on the throne. It's just been the Queen for so long, as we all know. So these are very good witnesses, but they have a sense of humor, and they're very practical. They're very willing to talk about their bizarre experiences and say, I have no explanation for this, but here's my story. And the tower is filled with those kind of stories. And I think there's a degree of superstition that goes hand in hand with that history.
What's a little bit of the history of the tower, just to bring our listeners into context?
Well, where do we begin? I mean, the building is essentially, it was always said that whoever controlled the tower controlled England. And the kings and queens of Britain have used it as an arsenal. They've used it as a base of power on the Thames for hundreds of years, certainly 1,000 years. And then, of course, it became the nation's dungeon. If you incurred the monarch's wrath, they threw you in the tower. And a lot of the time, you were tortured pretty horrifically and never made it out alive. So there were hundreds, if not thousands, of executions upon Tower Hill. A lot of people spent many, many years being tortured. The torture equipment, replicas of it, and some of the original stuff is still there for you to see. And the entire place just has this terrible atmosphere. This atmosphere of it's very difficult to explain, but it's a grim, dark, kind of foreboding atmosphere. The kind of place a horror writer would love to write about.
And the walls are made up of stone, I suspect. And is it limestone bricks that it's made up of?
And are you heading towards the stone tape theory there, Brent, when we're talking about limestone?
Well, we could go into that if you'd like.
We sure could, and it's certainly one valid explanation for what happens there. There's stone, there's brick, there are lots of things. There are newer parts of the tower, barracks that were added during the Napoleonic era and afterwards when the Duke of Wellington was superintendent of the tower for a time. So much newer parts, much older parts, and multiple different towers within the main tower grounds.
Okay, and famous people were held there. I'm thinking of Rudolf Hess, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
The Second World War was held there, and the story behind that, folks, is Rudolf Hess was Hitler's secondary, and he made this flight over to Britain. He was captured. He bailed out of his airplane. He was captured and held in the Tower of London. Now, just to add to that story, Aleister Crowley was brought in to interrogate him, of all people. So there's a whole occult little connection going on there as well. So you say there's this big, dark presence, I guess you could say, for lack of a better way of putting it, right in the tower. Are you an empath yourself? Could you feel it? Did it feel like a burden?
I'm not an empath myself, and yet my wife is American, of course, we both feel drawn back to the tower. Every time we return to London, we always go back to two places, one being Westminster Abbey, one being the tower. And there's just an atmosphere that draws you back. And when you get there, it's almost as though the stones can speak. And as an investigator, I'm pretty level-headed, pretty hard-headed. I'm not someone that claims to be empathic. My brain doesn't work in that way. But there is something about that place that I keep going back and going back and going back.
Is it a creepy draw? Do you get unnerved?
It can be. As it gets darker, the place can definitely be creepy. But where else can you see graffiti that was etched into the stone hundreds of years ago? And you can just hear about all of the tragedy that occurred there. People that were imprisoned for decades without ever being allowed to leave. And the place just kind of speaks to you.
Was there one story, or several stories, I should ask, about the tower that has stood out amongst the others? And perhaps coming from a more credible source than perhaps some of the others as well?
Certainly, Brent, the story that sent a shiver down my spine was when I was hearing about one of the yeoman warders making his rounds at night and had taken his son with him on his rounds. Dad takes his kid to kind of see how things go. And the kid was playing around very, very close to the tower where the two young princes' bodies were found, the two skeletons that were believed to be the young princes murdered by Richard III. Although actually there's some debate now whether Richard did it or didn't. It's a great murder mystery. But anyway, this man who was a very senior former member of the armed forces, very level-headed chap, said, "Okay, we're moving on. It's time to go." And his son said, "Just a minute, Dad. I'm playing with the two boys here." Yeah, and that.
Oh my God.
And apparently that particular yeoman warder does not like working in that part of the tower anymore, from what I was told.
Who can blame him? Were there other stories that stood out to you as well?
Oh, and they go back over the years. I mean, perhaps one of the most fascinating is the sentries, and we're looking back now something like 80 years ago, but one of the sentries actually approached a headless figure one misty night. The figure of a headless woman tried to stick his bayonet into it and fainted because of the shock of what he's seen. This is a story that's well known at the tower. And of course, fainting on sentry duty is a big deal. If you're found unconscious on sentry duty, that can be pretty harshly punished in the military, particularly back then. But it turned out that he wasn't the only guardsman that had seen this particular figure wandering around on that night. And the figure of a bear, of all things, has been seen, a great big grizzly bear. Bear baiting was one of the unfortunate methods of entertainment back in Britain historically. And so the figure of a huge growling bear has been seen, the apparition of a bear wandering around the tower.
Now, when you said a headless woman, right away I thought of Anne Boleyn.
Mm.
Is there any speculation that it might be her still haunting the tower?
Actually, yes. And one of the places, here's a tip if you happen to go to London and visit the tower. If you take the tour, the guided tour, and I strongly recommend you do that, hope for bad weather. Because if the weather is bad, if it's raining, the yeoman warders will open up what's called the Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. And if you go in there, that's where quite a number, it's a very small chapel, beautiful building. It's usually not part of the tour, but Anne's body is believed to be buried under the altar there. And one officer saw a parade, a ghostly parade of figures. He was looking through the window from the outside one evening, peeking in because he'd seen some ghostly radiance, some kind of light coming out of the windows. Was peeking in and saw this parade, and it looked like Anne was at the head of the parade, leading a whole bunch of dead figures down the aisle between the benches in the chapel.
Wow, what a story.
Mm.
When you were in London, are there any stories that surround Buckingham Palace, perhaps?
You know, Buckingham Palace does have a couple of ghost stories, but not as many as you would think. There has been at least one death by suicide there. But the palace is somewhere that tends to keep its ghost stories a little close. I think because if you look at the media, the Queen has had more than one, unfortunately, crank visitor, someone that has tried to jump the wall and get in and has succeeded. So they tend not to talk about it so much at Buckingham Palace.
Yeah, that's what I thought. It going back to what I was told about Sir John Aeshouse, our founding father, they just try to keep that. Otherwise, I guess they'd have ghost hunters at the plenty, trying to hop the fence and get pictures and things of that, and maybe break-ins. So I understand that completely. Now, in London, did you go? Is there any story surrounding the bridge?
Which bridge are we talking
London
about? Because there are several.
London Bridge.
Now, when we say London, and the reason I bring this up, I'm not being obtuse, but everyone, or at least many people, think of Tower Bridge when we say London Bridge.
So I guess that's it. Is that
Correct?
The one that is built on little kids' skulls, or is that just a myth?
Oh, that I had not heard, although I like the story. I'm going to look into it when we're done talking.
Okay.
That I had not heard. The bridge that I certainly do know is haunted is Westminster Bridge, which crosses the Thames outside the Houses of Parliament. And it's very close to the London Eye. So if you cross the Thames towards the London Eye, the big Ferris wheel there, you're walking across Westminster Bridge. Very, very haunted and was a suicide hotspot for many years. So there is a ghostly barge or boat that passes underneath the bridge but never comes out on the other side. And the ghost of a drowned woman who has appeared on the deck of tourist boats, cruise, what's the word I'm looking for? Taking a cruise of the Thames, and the ghost of a lady that was supposed to have drowned herself intentionally at that spot many years ago.
So you have all this residual apparition type of energy floating around all the time. What about Parliament itself? Now, this is something I've tried to investigate here in Canada on Ottawa Parliament Hill. And again, closed doors when it comes to things like that, even though I've heard from security guards that it's, apparently Sir John A. walks around there too. Sir John A. was a little bit of he was a happy fellow, let's put it that way. He frequented the pubs around here as well.
Parliament, as far as I'm aware, it's again impossible to get into, because we might see how our tax money's spent. Where would it be spent? But right immediately next to it is Westminster Abbey, which is where Britain buried all of its heroes for so many centuries, our oldest and most esteemed church. The Abbey is renowned for being haunted. The ghost of the unknown soldier is there. I'm sorry, the tomb of the unknown soldier is there, and a ghostly figure from the era of World War I has been seen at the tomb standing there silently. And of course, we still don't know and will never know who is buried there. But there is also a talking ghost, a genuinely intelligent apparition at the tower, a monk who goes by the name of Father Benedictus, and he's been known to appear to be completely solid, to talk to tourists, engage them in conversation, and then slowly disappear.
Wow. These are incredible stories. So folks, if you get to London, you've got to look these places up. And just to tell you a little bit more about that thing I had heard about the children's bodies, it comes from the song London Bridges Falling Down, My Fair Lady. And apparently what it is they took the orphans and just buried them under the bridge to support the whole bridge. And this is what I've heard. I don't know if it's...
I do know that the song involves the Black Death, the plague, and so forth. So I'm not aware of that connection, but now I'm going to go research it.
Let me know if it's true or not.
I'll let you know what I find out. With folklore, it's so difficult to find out sometimes, to separate the myth from the reality.
That's right. Very true. Very, very true. What were some of the hot spots in London that really, I don't know, that drew you there? What made you want to do this type of research in London and not just keep it to North America? We'll get to Colorado in a second as well.
Sure. Well, I love London as a city. It's a beautiful place, friendly people, but their history is just incredible. You have history going back to Roman times and beyond. And when you have so many people, so many generations living on top of the ashes of the last one for generation on generation, you're going to get these spots of paranormal activity. You are going to get ghosts and hauntings, and they're just so colorful and so fascinating. So if you're a history buff, and I am, I love my history, and you're interested in the supernatural or paranormal, I should say, the great place to put them together is a city like London or Washington, D.C., somewhere with history to it. And of course, Canada does not lack for that either.
Oh, no,
but any of the nation's capital.
And I always make the same joke. If you're looking for aliens, look no further than Ottawa. We just call them politicians. MPs, members of parliament, folks, in Canada. Yeah, there you go. When you go back and you look back at the history of 20 years, is there a certain geographical era or a certain geographical area, I should say, that really steps out and says, wow, I never realized there was so much paranormal activity in that place as opposed to the other places I've looked at?
I think that London is renowned for being, I would say, pound for pound, probably the most haunted city on earth, although the city of York makes that claim also in the UK. But the areas close to the Thames, where you had the ships coming in, of course, you had people leaving for new lives and those kind of things. Buildings around the Thames, like the Clink prison, which I investigated for this book, and it's where we actually derived the name, the Clink, from. You were thrown in the Clink. The Clink was a real place. Places like that are clustered together, close to major transportation hubs, have a lot of hauntings and a lot of ghost sightings. Speculation
as to why?
I think, again, it comes down to the fact that you have a lot of people and a lot of emotion, and that's perhaps the key factor. The emotion, you have a lot of happiness, a lot of sadness. You have people coming, people going, starting lives, ending lives. And of course, London is a city too that has seen a great deal of drama over the years. A lot of tragedy, a lot of riots. We've seen bombing during the World Wars. The Tower of London, something a lot of people don't know, the last deaths in the tower, at least to my knowledge, occurred when the IRA let off a bomb and killed bunch of tourists during the 70s.
Oh, geez, I wasn't aware of that at all. No, of course, I'm aware of the IRA, but I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's not very common knowledge.
Yeah.
But the same also happened in one of London's major parks. So you have a big metropolis like that, and you get stories like this that just go on. They're generational. Each generation has its tragedies and has its joys and its woes. And I think once you layer that on thick enough, it gets into the atmosphere of a place. It gets into whether it's the stonework or the natural elements. We're not sure of the mechanism, but this is really why we see haunted places.
Did you get a chance to go to Whitechapel at all? And folks, Whitechapel?
Not yet. It's on my wife's wish list.
Okay.
To go do the Jack the Ripper tour.
Yeah.
We prioritize the tower so much. Whitechapel's on a list that we're going to have to get to.
Okay, I was just curious if you'd had a chance. Now, you had mentioned that you used the Ouija board. Now, that's always been verboten for me. You see, I make the little cross to keep the vampires away, too. Mm-hmm. And what made you use that as a tool? Is that a good instrument for folks to use, or should they use it with caution?
Well, I've only ever used it once, and that was in London. It was in the Clink jail. I own a Ouija board, or I should say more accurately, my wife does. I've heard so many horror stories, if you will, from investigators and from just casual folks that have used them and have seemingly opened a doorway to something unpleasant that they then had a hard time getting rid of. I don't use them on a regular basis. But when the opportunity presented itself to do that underneath a very historic building near the Thames, I thought, why not? Let's give it a try. If something's going to follow me home, it's going to have to go 5,000 miles. So we did. And it was an interesting experience. And of course, we're all aware of the theories of how the Ouija board works. There are skeptical theories that say it's all micromuscular tremors within the hands, that it's being guided by the subconscious of the people using it. I can tell you that one of the ladies that was using it along with me is absolutely convinced that she was in contact with the spirit of her dead father.
Really?
Yeah.
Can you walk us through when you use the Ouija board, how you set it all up, what time of day, et cetera, et cetera? Just give us a brief synopsis of how that
Sure. Well, this was an overnight investigation, but quite honestly, if you were going to use it, and by the way, it's not something I would advocate. It's not something I use commonly, and I'm not going to recommend that anyone does it. You can make your own with random letters. In fact, I know people that simply tear up or cut up pieces of paper and mark them with letters of the alphabet, yes, no, and numbers. So the board itself, I don't know that has any significance. I suspect it's the intent that you put behind it, that desire to open a doorway and communicate with something. So those kind of boards come in many forms and still officially are classed as a toy. But there is no real reason why you would do this after dark, at midnight, or whatever, as opposed to 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
So you could still open that portal at any time. It doesn't have to be at night or anything like that, or...
Well, that would be my suspicion, and again, assuming that's what we are doing. Nobody's entirely clear on what's happening with the Ouija board, and we're also not sure what's happening 100% of the time, because I suspect some of those cases of the Ouija board spelling out something meaningful are just the subconscious of the users, but there are others that are not so easy to explain away.
What were some of the questions you asked the Ouija board when you were using it?
Well, I was a little disappointed, to tell you the truth, because in close to 20 years of paranormal investigation, I've always kind of hoped to come into contact with one of my grandparents, or since my mom passed, maybe hear from her. And I was a little disappointed that didn't happen. So when it appeared that one of these ladies...
Did you ask specific... Oh, you did, eh?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So you try and narrow down, are you in contact with an entity that is earthbound to that specific location? So in the case of the Clink, were you a prisoner here? Were you a warder here? There were also doctors. In fact, one of the apparitions seen in that place is a plague doctor with the stylized face masks that we're all familiar with.
Sure.
So you try and ascertain that. When it appeared that this was the parent of one of the other investigators, then it went down a much more personal path. And I don't think I've ever seen a witness go from tears of happiness to tears of being upset so quickly as this particular instance. She was very moved, and very upset. And then her father, I guess, was a large fan of the football, or soccer as the Americans would call it. So she started asking him about the England game, which the British team, which we really probably shouldn't get into, which had played the week before. And she said, what did you think of the way England played last week? And the board went to the S, and then the H, and then the I, and then the whole circle just fell about laughing. And she was in tears and said, that's my dad. That's exactly what my dad would have said. That's the word he would have used about how they played last week.
Shite. Yeah, I see no defense. That's the problem with England. Good offense, no defense.
I'm not being drawn down that route. I got nothing.
No dog. Okay. No worries, my friend.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. nightfrightshow.com.
Richard Estep is our guest tonight, folks. We're talking about his brand new book, and it's one you can get very easily at www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order it from the comfort of your armchair. The book is called In Search of the Paranormal. Now, Richard's been searching or hunting or a paranormal researcher for 20 years. And we've just gone through a bunch of hauntings that he's investigated over in London. We're going to come back to the New World now, and specifically, you had mentioned that there was a haunted firehouse in Colorado. How did you find out it was haunted? Now, when I think of the New World, you know, I think of old Montreal, of course. I think of mostly of New England. I don't think really of Colorado as being haunted because it's so new. But I guess that's a misnomer, for sure.
Well, new is a relative term, for sure. You still have a fairly long, as I see it, and relatively bloody history. And indeed, this is kind of a frontier area. We have a lot of the settlements, how the West was won, that kind of stuff. You have the wagon trains and all that kind of thing. So Colorado definitely has its history. And this part of the country has a number of fascinating haunted places. I heard about this place. I'm a firefighter myself, a volunteer firefighter. So I'd heard about this place through the network. Kind of somebody had said, hey, you should come check out our firehouse. And I always follow up on those kind of things. Now, this place was a museum. It was a working firehouse until the 70s or 80s. I want to say the 80s, when they just took it out of service. It was a historic firehouse, but you know how fire departments are. They change their coverage. They move their engines based upon how the city is growing. And so what they did was they just left it, and I mean this in the best way. They didn't allow it to fall into ruin. They made it the department museum. So walking in there, it's a treasure trove of firefighting history. You can see these very old ladders and these old devices and an old Model T car, the Chief's car, which works. A couple of guys I've got to give a shout out to, and Gary Michelli is one of them, that just maintain this stuff and keep the department's history literally alive. And so they said, we've got some weird stories to tell you about this place, and we'd like you to come in and spend a couple of nights here, which is what we ended up doing.
So what did you find when you were there? Did you ever see an apparition or anything like that? Or
no, and that's something that has been a constant throughout my career, is that they've been seen around me, but I've never seen one myself. I'm still looking and still waiting for that. But we did have a number of interesting, unusual experiences there. And the firehouse you may have seen, or your viewers and listeners may have seen on a show called Haunted Collector on the Sci-Fi Channel, where John Zaffis collects haunted objects and tries to figure out the backstory. And the company that made that show for the Sci-Fi Channel had approached me and said, what is your most interesting case right now? And it happened to be this particular location.
what was the object? Can you tell us what the object was?
So I can, and it kind of involves going through the stories of what's been seen there. So as an engine house, this place hasn't been active, as I said, in several decades, but you walk in there, and the first thing that strikes you as you approach the building is on one side is a huge mortuary.
Oh.
Yeah, it's huge. In fact, the department historian told me, and this took about problems, I guess we have no problems today in relation to what firemen used to have. One of the big complaints was at weekends, the firemen would be eating their dinner and they would be burning the bodies next door in the mortuary, and the ash would drift in through the windows.
Oh, man.
And kind of spoil lunch.
That kind of
Yeah.
puts life today in perspective, doesn't it?
It really, really does.
Yeah.
So we kind of got looking at who the personalities were that had lived and served in that firehouse and around the department over the years. And there is a wall of photographs there of firefighters that have been killed in the line of duty. And one involved an incident where a crew was responding to a call and were involved in a road traffic accident. And a number of them were unfortunately killed. So my first thought was, do we have somebody that was involved in this incident that is still hanging around the department? And as I talk to firefighters from around the US and around the UK also, and I suspect around the world this is true, a lot of firehouses seem to have their resident ghost story. And my theory on it is, it's not so much to do with the fact that firefighters are involved with death and that kind of turmoil on a daily basis. It's a family environment. You know, for many of us, it's our second family, and we truly love those places. And I've always believed that when you see a long-term haunting of a residence, it's because somebody suffered there enormously. The tower, I think that's true. People that just lived in misery and ended their lives in turmoil. And then on the other hand, it's somebody who loved the place very much. And perhaps part of them has remained, or they returned to visit after their death. And I really suspect that's what's going on, at least partly with this particular firehouse. I think somebody loved that department and that place so much they don't want to leave.
No, I can see that, because I hear that a lot about old farmhouses, which there is plethora in the area. And they're all haunted to a one. You know, people will recognize me and come up at the local Costco and tell me their ghost story about the resident ghost that lives in their farmhouse. And I'm always saying, you know, it's because they always ask, why is it there? And I said, well, probably because it was their favorite place when they were on this side of the realm. And why not spend eternity there? But I want to ask you this, because you had mentioned a doctor that was in the clink. Any speculation why a doctor would stick around such a horrible place as that? Could that have been his most happiest, wonderful place?
Well, I don't think it was an intelligent haunting. And it's necessary, I think, Brent, for us to talk a little bit about the various types of hauntings. Because we use the word ghost as a kind of umbrella term, one size fits all.
Yes,
and that really isn't what we're talking about. And the analogy I like to use is cancer. We use the word cancer as if it's one disease, but it's really an umbrella that doctors use to talk about a multitude of pathologies that kind of act in the same way. And the same is, I think, true with ghosts. So at one end of the spectrum, we have those that interact with us, that we can question, that you hear about talking to people, responding, sometimes even touching and handing objects over and those kind of things. And on the other, we have the kind that seem to be more like recordings. We have those that aren't aware of people, the ones that behave as the characters on your TV screen do. So you throw in a DVD, you watch, I don't know, Star Wars, because it's awesome, right? Pointing to the stormtroopers above my head, something like that. Harrison Ford's not actually there. He's not going to answer your questions, you know. And so we get ghosts that kind of react in that way, that seem to be some kind of imprint or recording upon the place or the environment itself. And then we get those in the middle that are kind of a mix, that do seem to interact with the environment in some way, but not completely intelligently. So I suspect that the doctor in the clink is of that category that is more of a recording. That perhaps this gentleman spent a great deal of time there. It must have been extremely difficult, to say the least, to care for plague victims. You know, watching patient after patient die, and to do so in jail, where, from their point of view, they were dealing with the scum of the earth. They were dealing with criminals. Even though it wasn't quite that way in the clink, you could be thrown in there for nothing more than being a debtor that couldn't pay their debts. And you had actually children born there. You had families raised there whose parents never got to leave. You know, so it must have been heartbreaking and just emotionally turbulent to be in that place for any great period of time. And I think that's something of what lingers in the form of a recording when he is seen.
Are you a believer in EVPs, electronic voice phenomena?
You know, I am, and I've collected a number myself. I think that many of them are. It's very easy to misattribute random sounds and static and things like that as an EVP, but some are so clear.
Yeah.
They are undeniable. They are undeniably voices. Where they come from is the question. And EVPs have been around as long as we've had recording technology.
That's right.
And they followed us from reel-to-reel tape recorders to digital voice recorders and hard drives. They followed us from one set of technology, from analog to digital.
How do you make your decision on what instrument to use to contact the other side? You had mentioned a Ouija board you used once. There was a dowser you'd use, and now EVPs. How do you make your decision? Do you make that on the spur of the moment when you're into the environment, or do you do that beforehand?
So much of it depends upon the reported instances of the haunting. So if voices, noises, auditory phenomena are prevalent, we'll do a great deal of EVP investigation, and we'll make that a priority. If the haunting tends to involve other things, so for example apparitions, again we'll still do that experimentation, but we're more likely to focus on the visual, trying to place cameras and I don't provoke. That's a term that I'm not really a fan with, but I am happy to stimulate. And a good example, going back to the firehouses, we had EVP recorders running and didn't get any spectacular EVPs there, but we got our EMF meters showing some wild and crazy spikes in response to certain questions. And it was two very definite subject areas that were making these meters spike when I asked about them. Knowing the fire service as I do, I picked up on a couple of, no pun intended here, but hot button subjects. One was divorce. I started asking about divorce, and it seems like a great many of the people in our profession have turbulent private lives. And if I may just say, Brent, there is an organization called the Code Green campaign, which helps with firefighter, police officer, first responder, mental health and wellness. 10% of the profits from In Search of the Paranormal are being donated to that charity. They do great.
That's great. Can you send me that link? I'll make sure it goes up.
Certainly I can. And that's also on my website, richardestep.net, also, the Code Green campaign. Great work. Anyway, turbulence and a certain degree of emotional instability comes, I think, with the profession of responding to emergencies. We see things that most people don't want to see and should never have to see, you know? So problems with family lives and stuff are kind of woven through for a lot of firefighters, paramedics, police officers. So I got asking about divorce, and we saw some very real spikes. And then I got to thinking about the era in which this firehouse had closed down, late 70s, kind of 80s. I couldn't give you the exact year, I'm afraid, but it was right around that era. And one of the contentious issues at that point was women in the fire service.
That's right.
It was a very male-dominated service. You know, I grew up in the 70s saying fireman because that's how it was. You know, the perception was that only men were strong enough to perform in the fire service. And of course, we've since learned better, and that's a wonderful thing. But during that era of transition, women were not particularly well regarded. The first female firefighters had a very hard time of it. And so it was a contentious issue. So I was asking about, what do you think about women in the fire service, huh? Imagine having women on your department trying to drag you out of a fire. How do you think that would go? Do you like that idea? And this thing was just swinging like nuts. Like I definitely hit a trigger object. And so then one of my fellow investigators would ask something more innocuous, you know. We'd ask about a big fire that might have occurred, or tell us about some of the responsive that you went on. Nothing. But when we came back to divorce or females in the fire service, boom.
Boom, it just exploded all over the place. It's funny you mentioned that because I go back to the 80s. Yes, folks, I'm that old. No kidding. Cut me open, count the rings. A good friend of mine was the first female police officer in Montreal. I'm originally from Montreal. And the stuff that she had to go through, you know, to beat down the path for the others to follow was pretty inspiring, actually.
Yeah, pioneer is a word that I would use in the most respectful sense of the term for those ladies.
Very much so, very much so. Richard Estep is our guest tonight, folks. www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover and order the book from the comfort of your own home. Also, check out all his connections. That'll be posted as well. You can go to his website, and of course the green. Help me out with the name of it again. The
Code Green campaign.
Code Green campaign. The link for that will be there as well, and please do make a donation if you're able to. It would be much appreciated. It does good work. Kingston, folks, as you know, I say this all the time, is Canada's version of West Point. This is where we train all our guys that are in the service, and PTSD is a real deal. Make no mistake. I know lots of
It is indeed.
Yeah. So, they're out there putting their selves on the line for us every day. So let's give a little bit back. Okay, Richard, let's continue. Now, how does your wife feel about you not being a firefighter so much, although I'm sure that causes her, whenever you go out, there's always that pit in the bottom of her stomach, is he going to return? But, you go out to these dark, dungy places. Now, does she accompany you on every research investigation?
Not every one, at least not anymore. But Laura helped co-found the team with me, so it makes for an interesting date night for us. And we also
I have to laugh at that because it's not the first thing I would do on a date night. But anyways, right. That sounds interesting.
But we also get to travel across the country. So one of the ways I'm able to sell this to my wife, if you will, is that we get to go take a trip somewhere cool. And my definition of somewhere cool is somewhere haunted. And Laura's definition of somewhere cool is somewhere she can hit a beach or shop. Actually, I'm being a little facetious. Also, she's very much into history. Also, yeah. So that's kind of why London is a very easy sell.
And I think London originally. I should have asked you that.
I'm sorry.
Are you from London originally?
Oh, I'm from a place called Leicester, Leicestershire, which is not quite in London. And I'm embarrassed to tell you that, at least here in America, when people ask me which part of England I'm from, I got so used to getting a glassy stare when I said I'm from Leicester. I just say, oh, I'm from north of London. So I'm not actually a Londoner. I come from Leicester, but close enough that I know the city well.
I get you. Yeah, it's a suburb, isn't it? Well, it's a little bit further than the suburb, but it's just outside the city. So, yeah.
I guess by American distances, though, that's kind of accurate because everything is so large here and so spaced out. It's understandable.
It takes 2.5 days to drive across Ontario, and that's only 1 out of 10 provinces. So
wow.
Yeah, it's wild. 2.5 days, folks. You could be in Scotland and come back. So that's the difference in size. It's just, it's just
Canada is on my bucket list.
Well, you got to.
So I would like to hit at some point and see some hauntings.
There's some really good haunted. Well, we have a penitentiary here that goes back to 1820. And this is where we keep used to keep all our serial killers and stuff up until 2 years ago. And there's really been a lot of activity there. Tons and tons of activity. So, yeah, there's a lot of history here.
I would love to hear from some of your Canadian listeners. Shoot me an email. I like to connect with folks through my website, richardestep.net, and let me know what you think are some of Canada's best hauntings. And I would like to get a trip going out there.
Yeah, good for you. Yeah. And if you get up this way, there's lots of great pubs here. So,
awesome.
I don't know if Guinness is your favorite, but we'll find something that you could...
I love Guinness.
Yeah, me too. Why do you think I look like this? Hello. This isn't by accident. Let's go back.
Well,
go ahead.
They say you are what you drink. I'm stout and bitter.
Let's go back to the paranormal. What are the differences between North America and something as old as London? I'll tell you a funny story. I'd met this girl at McGill, and I took her down to Old Montreal, which goes back about 400 years, and I was giving her a little bit of the history of Montreal, North America, and stuff like that. Well, she was from Persia. Her history goes back 6,000 years. So as soon as she said that, we went for an ice cream, and I stopped showing off. Is it that type of thing also with the paranormal?
In terms of going back how far in history?
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, is there Roman ghosts and Druid ghosts? And...
The Romans gave us the first recorded ghost story that I'm aware of in Roman literature, and it was a fascinating case. And I'm trying to recall what the specific source was because it's in one of their written histories. I want to say it was Pliny. Whether it was Pliny the Elder or the Younger, I couldn't tell you. But it was a story of a Roman villa that was haunted by the spirit of an apparition that this may be where we derive the stereotype from, actually emerged at night with the clanking chains.
Yeah.
So the clanking of chains were heard to herald the onset of this apparition, and would walk to a spot in the courtyard of this villa and point to a specific spot. And so finally, when the Roman who owned the villa went and dug there, he of course found, surprise, surprise, the bones of a murdered man who had been buried there in this villa that he had bought. So that's such a cool story, and I think that's the earliest one. But I mentioned the city of York in Britain earlier on. York has one of the famous ghost, I want to say it's the Chancellor's House or something along those lines. It's a governmental home in York where down in the basement they had somebody performing work on the utilities. It was either a plumber or somebody of that professional nature, and saw a parade of Roman soldiers, including one on horseback, come trooping through that cellar. And what's kind of fascinating is that he recorded what he saw. And the shield, we think of Romans, we've seen movies like Gladiator and shows like Spartacus, and we think of those big kind of square-shaped, elongated shields as what the Romans have. You don't really see them with round shields, and he reported them as having round shields, I want to say. And then when they did the research on the Roman garrison that had been stationed in the area, sure enough, this particular garrison had those shields as he'd reported them, not the conventional ones we would think of. So stuff like that, when you interview a witness, really excites me and fascinates me. It's the little details that people wouldn't think of to, if their mind was playing tricks or if they were trying to defraud you, people just wouldn't think of stuff like that.
Have you been up to Stonehenge?
I've not been up to Stonehenge. Again, that's on my wife's bucket list of places to visit. I've not heard of any ghosts or apparitions around Stonehenge itself, which you would think, given the sheer age of it and the nature of its construction, there would be something attached there. But we still don't entirely know the purpose of Stonehenge or if anybody died there.
I'm going to come back to the New World, and you had mentioned York, and I was going to talk about New York and the Twin Towers in particular. Often you hear, especially in the military, when there's been a battle, and a lot of people have died suddenly, their ghosts tend to stick around for various reasons. Some say it's because they don't realize they've passed on.
Mm-hmm.
The Twin Towers, and I've asked various investigators the same question. Is it too soon to investigate the area around the Twin Towers?
That's a great question, and I think above all else, as a paranormal investigator, you have to be respectful. That's the number one thing, and it's why I don't believe in provocation, because having seen some of these ghost hunting shows, and you see so-called investigators abusing and name-calling all this kind of stuff in an effort to provoke a reaction, if that were my dead relative, I would not be okay with that. So above all else, no matter what environment I'm in, I'm respectful. And I think that investigating in the area of the Twin Towers, certainly within this current generation, would be hugely disrespectful to the families of those that died there. So I think a great deal of time needs to pass.
Yeah, I agree with you 110%, but I just thought I'd throw that out to you. Continuing with New York, have you been in New York at all?
I have been to New York several times.
Was there any particular area you would, because it's not that far from where I live. A lot of Canadians go down to New York City, either from Montreal, Toronto, or Kingston. It's like a 6-hour drive, which may seem like a lot to a UK person, but it's really not that big a deal when you're in North America. Was there any particular spot that you would recommend that people could go to for some sort of haunting?
Well, I think New York is replete with its ghost stories. And my friend Keith Richardson, who is a firefighter and comes from a long Irish, by way of New York, firefighting family, talks about his grandfather's firehouse being haunted. So it seems like New York has a ghost on every street corner. When I was there, I was purely a tourist looking into the history of places like Battery Park, and I did visit Ground Zero and pay my respects there. But the one thing that I wanted to do, purely because I'm an enormous nerd, is go to the New York Public Library from, you'll recall Ghostbusters, the movie, and come running down those steps, which is what happens to Bill Murray, Dan Aykroyd, and Harold Ramis when they're chased out by that lady. And, we still have that joke on my team of, if we don't have a plan, get her.
Get her. I'll give you a little bit of
that was your plan, Ray? Get
It
Yeah.
sounds like a great plan. I'll give you some trivia. Dan Aykroyd lives in Kingston. He's from Kingston. And he wrote Ghostbusters just up at his farmhouse. And the reason why he got into the paranormal and all that stuff in the beginning is because his family used to do seances at the farmhouse all the time. I had his dad on the show, that's why, several years ago.
Oh, wow.
The book. So there's some trivia for you.
That is awesome. And Ghostbusters is still one of my favorite movies.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, without question. Where's your next research going? Where is this taking you? Where do
Well,
you
I've
wanna go
just
next?
finished the manuscript of a book that will be out in January called The World's Most Haunted Hospitals. As a paramedic, I've been fascinated with hospitals and the fact that every hospital has its ghost stories. And as you'd mentioned earlier, Brent, when we talked about places not wanting to talk stories, hospitals are absolutely the poster child for that. Hospital administrators do not want any ghost stories getting out because it's not conducive to, the healing and the calm and tranquility that's supposed to take place in the hospital. But if you get many nurses, physicians, and folks that work in hospitals talking over a pint of beer, it's amazing how many of them have their ghost stories. And I said, hey, there's a book in that, and I want to write it.
Every nurse I have ever spoke to, male, female, whatever, has a ghost story. That something has happened and they've seen the apparition and they've seen, the person walk out of the room or something and the body was. So, yeah, there's something. There's something to it. And there's a psychiatric hospital here, too, that's been abandoned. And it's supposed to be just filled with activity. So I'm really looking forward to that book. And you'll have to come back when that's been published. So
I would be delighted to do that. And the case I'm currently working on is in Utah, just outside Salt Lake City.
Oh, wow.
It is an old abandoned hospital, which is now in private hands. And the guys that bought this, Kim and Cami Anderson, run a Halloween haunted house called Asylum 49. And they've had some very real and fascinating paranormal activity in there. The place was covered on Ghost Adventures, actually, in their 4th season, I believe. And so I'll be moving in there for a week. We're going to start on a Halloween night, the last night when the asylum is working as a haunted house proper, with the folks in the Halloween decorations and stuff. And then we're going to spend a week in the aftermath of that when the energy should be its greatest, because they have thousands of people coming through this place now. And a ghostly ER physician has been seen, and the ghost of a young girl has been seen. And their customers keep saying, the little girl you have in the corridor really creeped me out. And they're getting kind of tired of saying, yeah, we don't employ a little girl here.
Oh, my God, buddy.
So I'm hoping that at the height of their season, which peaks on the night of Halloween, when I move in for a week with my team, we are going to see if we can ride the energies that have built up while it's been operating as a haunted house and get some results as investigators.
Yeah, I think the chances of that are going to be very, very positive. I think you're going to catch something.
I'm very excited about it.
Have you ever opened the door and there's something beyond that door that you didn't know it was behind it? You wish you could have closed the door afterwards? Demons? Have you ever gone down that road?
I've not. I know that there are a number of cases of dark entities and so forth that my colleagues will talk about. I haven't really run into anything I would class as demonic. And what I usually tell people is what I'm afraid of is the living, not the dead. In fact, there was an instance in an old theater up here in the mountains in Colorado, and this was like a mining town, a classic cowboy town, We were investigating this theater, and I was in the doorway, standing in the doorway with a female investigator. I had my back to the doorway, and all of a sudden she went pale white. I mean, absolutely startled. And I looked at her and I said, Robin, this is really not a good time to be trying to put the scares into me and playing tricks. Because we have a sense of humor, but we have a policy of not, making fun of each other on investigations. You taint evidence that way. And she said, there's a cowboy behind you. And I said, no, seriously, knock it off. And she said, no, there's a cowboy behind you. And I turned around and there is this old, wizened cowboy with the Stetson hat and the shirt and stuff. The only thing he's missing is the 6-shooters at his hips. And so I locked eyes with him. And I'm thinking, this is the Holy Grail. This is it. This is my apparition. And I opened the door. And I'm trying to work up the courage to reach out and touch this guy to see if he's actually there. And he looked at me and he said in this kind of very frightening way, he said, "It's Friday night." And I said, "Yes, it is." And he said, "You're here." I said, "Yes, we are." And then he left it for an instant, and then he said, "Are you kids cooking meth in there again?" It turned out that this gentleman was one of the older residents of the town and cared about this historic building a great deal. Just happened to dress like somebody from that era because that was his thing. And I explained what we were doing. I said, "No, we have permission from the owner to be in here." And he said, "Well, that's good, because if you hadn't permission to be in there, if you were trespassing, we know how to bury bodies in this town."
Oh my God. That whole story just creeps me out. You had me going there, and then, what he says, and he's, oh yeah. So I get it. I understand. Fear of the living more than the dead. That's a great story. It's a great way to end it. We're coming up to the end of the show. Thank you so much, Richard, for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it. And
it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Hi, you got to come up to Canada, without question. In Search of the Paranormal is the name of the book. The author and our guest tonight has been Richard Estep. www.nightfrightshow.com. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover, and that'll take you to a place where you can order it from the comfort of your own home. And please do click on the Code Green URL that will be there within the next few days. And a big shout out to Kelly Logue for keeping the website up and running and putting all these links up there. He does it for free, folks. It's a volunteer radio show. He's a volunteer as well. So I do thank you all for that. And I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. NightFrightShow.com.